We're going to start in about 1 minute, so enjoy as you're eating, and then we'll be right up with you. Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the next portion of the program. I'll take a minute or so to just summarize a few of the things that we've discussed this morning and talk about the program and where it's going. So we started off with some background on translational research, and then Dr. Ford getting into some very specific issues of what it takes in terms of thinking about this type of project from an institution standpoint and engaging the community. Then panels on, well, obviously welcomes from our U.S. representative and governor. And then panels on thinking about it from a provider standpoint and a community engagement standpoint, and thinking, if you would, about how do we really think broadly in a term that Carolyn Jenkins used with me last evening when we were chatting, multi-level research. It's not just about doing research in a lab, if you will, or in human subjects, if you will, or in providing provisions of cares in hospital-based centers or in practices or in a community or in multiple communities or across the state. It's about a multi-level involvement and integration along the continuum that we talked about for translational research. And how do we get that going? So I wanted to reflect on a couple of questions that I heard during the morning and now into the early afternoon, is what are our next steps? And our next steps are actually the rest of this morning's program. And we're actually the afternoon's program. And bringing everyone together to think about these concepts and then splitting among some of the major issues that face the state, and also how do we communicate across the state in our workshops. So we have obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, infant mortality as a reflection of women's and children's health, family health, and then health communications, social networking, and building our capacity to communicate with each other. We mentioned the importance of the Community Advisory Committee, and that came out through further discussions. And as that group is an advisory source, but how it really needs to incorporate thought from many others and disseminate research out, bring input in, and help us think about how we develop research. The developing research is very important because this question was asked of me. Well, with $20 million, we can do an awful lot of research. And the interesting thing is we can get research started, but it's an infrastructure grant. And the real intention of this grant from the National Institute of Health is that $20 million over 5 years is an investment in us to build programs and incorporate more research and build networks and partnerships and think about how we're going to take research from step 1, 2, 3 to step 200, 300, 400, 500, 1,000 and beyond. So it's really just the start, as we said, but it is important to think about today is a great opportunity for the first time, bring everybody together and really have everyone with collective, collaborative thought to the workshops, think about, okay, what does it really mean to do to build the partnerships and build research? With that, I first of all won't have another opportunity to thank you all for being here, but thank you all for being here and for participating so well during the session so far. At the end of the talk by Dr. Quinlan, who I'll introduce in a moment, we're going to break into the workshops. Brian Raymer will come up and discuss the goals of the workshops and the organization of the workshops. And Omar Khan will have some closing notes for the conference. I'll note that there's an evaluation form. You may hear this a few times, but it's really important to hear back from you, your feedback and your thoughts about this and or other steps we should take forward. So please provide them on the form. Also, continue to look at the website. You've already got that, because the website will become an interactive forum for discussion of some of these topics. That's at least one of the goals that we have for it. So we'll be looking to that. I will move into the introduction for Dr. Quinlan. You have a printed introduction for Dr. Quinlan. I won't tell you a whole lot about what's on the paper. I will recognize that he is now the lead for the Ochsner Clinic Foundation and International Affairs, and he spent a long time as the CEO of the Ochsner Clinic, and he's been recognized multiple times as one of the top health executives in the country. That is great to know. I can tell you that Pat was recommended to me by the CEO of ChristianaCare, Bob Laskowski, who I think travels some similar circles, and said to me about 5-6 months ago, Mike, I know this guy Pat Quinlan, who really has some interesting thoughts that relate to some of the stuff that you're doing and that the grant's doing, and how to perhaps think about things for us in Delaware. At which point I arranged a phone call with Pat, and he was terrific. First of all, he's a fairly busy guy, so it took me a couple weeks to get on the schedule. But when I did, the next hour was conversation about, Mike, this is really important. How we deal with health issues, how we think of them from systems, how we make sure we think about where to go with key health issues, and helped me form some of my thoughts for some of the things we talked about today. So in terms of the translational research aspect, as we mentioned, T1, T2, T3, and then to T4. Public health, what's it mean for public health, and how do we think about policy change that affects health? Fourth level of research. Although Pat himself is not a researcher, he's got some very important thoughts on some of the things that we can do, and this is the more stimulating thought part of our program, not that the other wasn't, but that was about some of the basics about how do we do the nuts and bolts, how do we think about it. This is the broader concept about, okay, we've got some evidence, where do we want to go with it, and how do we want to go? I used smoking not by accident. I knew Pat was going to talk about that, and when I looked at the health things over the last 75 or 50 years, I said, this is a pretty important one, and by the way, smoking affects cardiovascular disease, cancer, infant mortality, and tied with obesity and diabetes, it leads to a lot of other health risks and disability and degenerative problems. So you cover all of our health themes, if you will. If you include smoking, it affects all of them. So Pat has a particular interest in that. Obviously, I referenced to that in terms of the Ochsner Clinic, and obviously Dr. Alton Ochsner, who is the first one to be putting that down. We conclude cigarette smoking is causing lung cancer. Pretty impressive. So with that, it's really my delight. I'll be up here moderating a few questions toward the end, then Brian and Omar will come up, then we'll break for the workshops. But for now, please welcome, with applause, many times we can do it, I think, Dr. Pat Quinlan.
Well, thank you for that, Mike. My mom would be very grateful, and I am too. Forgive me for reading from my notes, but what I wanted to do was try to tie in some of the things that we've discussed today to make it a little more relevant and make the connection more clear. I am honored to be here, and I mentioned to Mike that I don't think I've ever been to a conference with so many people who were so attentive for so long. It's very difficult for grown-ups to pay attention that long. Our bodies talk to us, we have lots of distractions these days, but you've done it, and it was very impressive, and it speaks to your dedication to the subject. And what I hope to do is give you a perspective on a subject of where maybe together we could advance the cause of healthcare in this country tremendously by starting here in this room. So I thank you for that. In this room, we have a cross-section of people who go from basic research to clinical care to the public, and I think we have the right forum to begin to talk about how to make a difference. I think we have enough information in science to make the decision. What we really need, and we've heard late in the latter part of the morning, information about how social science then can guide us to behavioral change that makes a difference in outcomes. And in particular, we had a taste from our elected representatives really about where I think the greatest opportunity for change, but also the greatest obstacle, is ineffective government. And I have a confession to make. I harangued Bob a little bit because he'd often tell me about how Delaware was different. And as you heard and as I see, that in this state, you're different than most of the country, in that many different points of view are able to work together for the common good. And to really affect important social change, we as humans are most influenced by example. And I think that in Delaware you have an opportunity, although you're a small state, to have a huge impact in leading the way to a real solution in healthcare. Now, most of the things we've heard about today are important and necessary, but collectively probably insufficient to change in time those demographic changes and those physical changes that we heard about earlier today that you know all too well. As the population, as we have more and more elderly people like myself, a baby boomer, come on, well, that's when diseases become expressed. We have this tsunami of obesity that's sweeping our country, and all of them, we know what that means in terms of the chronic diseases, hypertension, diabetes, degenerative joint disease, and cancer. And the thing that I want to talk today about, though, that there is a solution in front of us if we choose to act, and that's the focus for today. So thank you for allowing me to interrupt your lunch, and please continue eating, and we'll attack this together. So I want to focus on tobacco because, to me, of the lifestyles, it's the one that is inexplicable, at least in terms of an intellectual approach, very understandable when you look at how it happened. And I want to focus in terms of reframing it around childhood. And I'll go over what the approach will be. You know, tell them what you're going to tell them, and here's that part. To me, I want to spend a lot on context, because as human beings, we know we're creatures of habit. That's how our brain works. That's how we become effective, which means we ignore a lot of things after a while, and we accept it as a given. And one of the things that is just absolutely insane, but we take as normal, is the whole smoking situation in this country. And I want to talk about how in particular, certain groups have been effectively and relentlessly targeted by the tobacco industry. That's children, minorities, and women, vulnerable populations, and how they continue to do it effectively. What those products are like, so we'll know what the challenges are. The myth of perfectly safe, it's a playbook that has worked for years and years and continues to work and is now being expanded. And then goes through some of the facts that you're already familiar with, but just to make the case around this is a childhood disease. Importantly, the disease that we see of smoking addiction is manifest and become most evident in adults, but it begins unequivocally in childhood. That's where we need to act. We'll talk about the cost of this country and to this state in terms of tobacco, and then end with what we can and should do. So to make the point, this is a solution to a much larger problem. That epidemic that I want to mention, by the way, is not an accident. It's by design, and we have to interrupt that design. And that's what's different about this than many other problems. So this epidemic is something that's important, and that's what I want to talk about. It's part of a larger solution. We can no longer buy our way out of problems in this country. I think that's become evident, and that's the way we've done it before, right? Guns and butter, you name it. We're a very wealthy country, and we bought our way out of problems. And I think with the health care and everything else coming together, we realize those days are over. And we're going to have to do something that's particularly difficult for us, particularly since we're in such an argumentative state in this country and such gridlock. We're going to actually have to think our way out of this problem. It's true. I mean, it's kind of funny, but it's true. And that's what this room is about. It's about the science part, but it's about the social activism part too, how we connect those two. So it's part of a much larger problem. What I would like to do is talk about our assumptions. Nobody in this room is stupid, but I think our error of omission, the problem lies in rooms like this around the country. We know what the solution is, but for some reason we have discarded it. We know it's about lifestyles, we know it's about changing behaviors, but for some reason we haven't taken it on, and I think it's because in our unconscious, unspoken motivation, it's because it isn't going to work, because it's kind of hopeless. And we're going to have to do what we can to nibble around the edges because we can't take this on because we'll lose, or it'll be such a painful discussion, I don't know if I'm up for it. Because why else would we know a solution and avoid it to such a catastrophic problem that threatens to cripple our country and basically abort our futures together? We'll spend all our money on people who are sicker and sicker. I think what we have, and I spoke to the two elected representatives earlier, that we've made a default decision. And we've made a default decision to avoid the lifestyle issue. We will not take it head on. And we've made the default decision that we've decided we're just going to live with it. We're going to, what Covey would call a scarcity mentality. We're going to do the best we can in a losing situation. And we're going to discard the abundance mentality that, yeah, there's a solution, and we're going to at least talk about it and ideally address it. Because one thing I learned was being a CEO, being a doc, I had to learn, I didn't have to have all the answers, but I did have to ask the right question, and then I did have to force decisions. So I want to ask some questions today that I would like you to think about at home, and then how do we force decisions to have an entirely different future? Because in our default decision, we have not told people clearly and relentlessly the consequence. The default decision not to take these on means that we'll have a progressively sicker population. It will cost us progressively more. We'll have a smaller base to support Social Security and everything else, national security. We'll have higher taxes and a much dimmer future as a country. And we made that decision without actively discussing the option, which is, we could say, you know what, we can knock this out fairly quickly. We know lifestyle is about half of the cost of disease, some say more. We know that if you manage disease correctly, chronic disease, which is 70% of cost, we can take out another 30% and not have a problem. And I'll take you through what I think are the two ways of looking at this. We can have diseases of choice, lifestyle, diseases of chance, genetics, and environment that's difficult to change. And if we take care of diseases of choice, we can take care of diseases of chance in ways that would make us proud. We talk about mental health, we talk about the disadvantaged, we talk about lots of things. We would have more than enough to take care of that and have money left over to take care of our other pressing needs. That's the proposal today. So I took this 75-25. The number is a little immaterial. The thrust of it is, some say it's 50% of cost and disease is lifestyle, some say up to 75 if you link them properly. So it's about a $1.5 trillion or more, depending on how you look at it. This nation will be a different country if we had $1.5 trillion more to dispose of to do the things we need to do. This nation would be much different in terms of productivity when you look at the opportunity that a healthy population has and the social benefit of having the elderly around to lead the young, and the social benefit of saying, we'd rather spend our money and our focus on health, and our focus should be, the right question is, why are we doing this? It's to have a long and healthy life, not to save money here and there. This isn't a technical issue, it's a higher purpose issue. And I think when we set the target right, which is say a long and healthy life, and measure everything we do against that, does this make sense or not, we have a different conversation. We have framed it differently. Higher purpose, better end. The 25, you know these numbers, 5% of people generate about 50% of the cost, 15 about 85% of the cost. That's where the disease management comes in, and that's where the scary part of the demographics come in, because with obesity, smoking, hypertension, those are chronic diseases that generate 70% of our cost. So there's the answer. And the question is, why don't we preface everything we say in healthcare and say, we have an answer, but by the way, we've chosen not to take it. And we'd rather live with the dire consequences I talked about than even discuss it as an option in public. Isn't that odd that we don't do that? And my question is, why don't we? And we have to think about that, because we need to, because I don't like the default decision. And I don't want to live in a country where I knew it could have been much better because we just decided we don't want to talk about it. It's kind of awkward. This is just one of many, many studies that will show you that the more of these lifestyle issues problems that you combine, the higher the cost. Now, this was just a study some years ago with public employees by the state of Arkansas that show how it all added up. Now, it didn't talk about productivity loss, it didn't talk about other issues, but just to state the obvious, that if you have these problems, that they tend to snowball, they tend to get worse, and it costs a lot more to take care of someone who's ill than someone who isn't. And these three criteria are avoidable. They are avoidable. At least in an 80-20 rule they are. We can take care of most of the problem by doing some common sense things that we have yet to engage in as a nation. So the focus then is the disease load. The problem with healthcare is not the delivery system, it's not the pricing. Those things contribute, but the fundamental, the root cause of our healthcare problem in this country is the disease load. And unless we reduce the disease load in this country, don't be surprised if you don't like what happens, right? Disease load. Every time it talks about public health, let's talk about the disease load. What are we doing to reduce that in a fundamental way, okay? And this is the discussion we have in Louisiana. We know that most of the chronic disease is due to these things, and what can we do about it? What areas will we focus on in order to effect that change? And what we've done is some trial programs led by our institution around let's attack the schools, let's attack the workplace, starting with our own example, and let's attack the churches as opportunities, because these are where people congregate, these are where they support one another, and we know one of the best ways to engage in behavioral change is with a supportive group that believe in something together, right? So how do we create oases of health rather than oases of disease? Because we know these behaviors are contagious. And how do we have good behaviors, although they're less contagious, how do we have good behaviors become the focus of our nation, right? And what do we do to make it easier to do the right things and a lot harder to do the wrong things? That's where government comes in. That's where the employers come in. That's where faith-based leaders come in. That's where communities come in. So we focus in particular, as an example, as the employer as a focus for change. And to lead that, we said, listen, we need to have the healthiest workforce in our state because we are the largest private employer in the state. And what are we doing about that? And I would say with Christianity, you've already done some things, but I think every healthcare organization in this country needs to say, we're going to have the healthiest employers. And if you talk about translational research, what are those things that we can do to incent people and disincentivize them to do the things that we're supposed to do? That's change. So the focus is, let's take on the obvious issue. I've noticed that it's the smarter people I'm around, the more they love the detail. You know, let's make this really complicated and let's unravel the knot. And it came to me the Gordian knot example and all the wise men around there and how do you untie this thing? And it's really complicated. And Alexander had a different idea. He took out a sword and he cut it in half. Said, you guys can get wrapped up in the details. I'm going to untie this thing. And I think that's sometimes what we need to do, and that's where collective wisdom and knowing just enough to solve the problem and being very clear on why you do things and what you're trying to accomplish. We want to cut this knot in half, and we can do it quickly if we choose to. So we've chosen the big three: obesity, smoking, and inactivity. And why do we like them? No more science. They can all be readily diagnosed. They are all actionable, and they're clearly beneficial to the individuals. The trade-off on doing all these things is, the negative trade-off is a long, healthy life. Most people can live with that kind of trade-off, right? And we heard it in the panels. How is it that you relate to people and what's in it for me? How about not dying of cancer? How about not being disabled? And I had so many patients when they would just get to retirement, their golden years, and then they crashed, right? Because they're about the right age. And they had a pretty miserable next 5 or 6 years prior to their death. How do we change that to where people really do have golden years, to where it's all worth it? And I think the consequences, you know, we talk about dollars, those of us who've seen the suffering with the people and the miserable deaths and the effects on their family, that dwarfs everything else. And I think it should provide us with enough energy to take on the difficult question. To the people who have a point, hey, this is my right. Hey, this isn't fair. What about employment? What about all these things? And I'd say, you know, when you add up the good versus the bad, this is the good side to be on. And we should be able to make that case. So here's the key point. Because I've been through this debate. I've lost twice in our state legislature to change something. We'll talk about that. But the cigarette is the only legal substance, and here's the key point, when used exactly as directed, is going to kill 480,000 Americans every year. Exactly as directed. That's the key. There is a safe drink. There is a safe firearm. There is a safe hamburger. People always want to say, yeah, but no, I said, no, this one's totally different. This is something that if you were to propose it today would be absurd. Here's the plan. We're going to addict a lot of kids, and the stuff we're going to addict them to also kills them in about 30 or 40 years. It's going to cost this nation $300 billion, and we have to make it really cheap so they can afford to get into it, and then we have to come together and make sure we do a lot of things to make sure that they can continue smoking. What do you say? The leading avoidable cause of death in America, and we support it. Ridiculous, but it's embedded, and what do we do about it? So, remember they have certain targets. And remember this key feature, is that we know this in this room. 90% of the people who smoke today as adults started when they were kids. It's an addiction of childhood. And they target 3 groups in particular: minorities, women, and children. And they do it very effectively, and largely with impunity. And I'll show you that there's a new wave of attack that we think we're making progress. We're getting ready to have a setback, I think. So here's the business model that we need to understand. We start with about 1.5 million new smokers every year as children. So people who think, hey, you know, we're making a lot of progress, it's illegal. So what? Here's 1.5 million kids who say that doesn't work. And here's 40 million adult smokers who say it hasn't worked. And there's 480,000 dead people who said we failed them. And that middle part about marketing, which is about an $8 to $9 billion effort on the part of tobacco, lobbying, business allies, government protection. About half of the states in this nation and the District of Columbia have designated smokers as a protected class, a perversion of the purpose of the protected class, which was to protect people from discrimination about something they couldn't change, your race, your gender, your religion, whatever it may be. And now as a smoker, you're given a degree of impunity, so we may perpetuate this addiction machine. And then, of course, there's deception and distortion. Courts don't use terms like racketeering loosely. We've got an industry that methodically has lied and deceived people for decades. And the amazing thing is, you've been in business sometimes, we got to put this behind us, make a settlement, put it behind us. You would think, with the discovery that occurred, with the callous disregard for life, and knowing full well that the target is children, you thought it's over. They've been blown out of the water. And with the settlement, it became quiet again, and they did, in fact, put it behind them with dollars. And the agreement that we reached, they liked it because they know it wouldn't work. Let's educate the public more. They love education because it's pretty ineffective. It's necessary, but grossly insufficient. Let's give them money for tobacco intervention. Great. What did we spend it on? State budgets. A little bit for smoking cessation. And I think the key point in this whole slide here is that the root cause of the problem is children. And that if you wait till you get to the 40 million adult smokers, you're working on the wrong end of the equation, and they love that. Let's focus on cessation, and let's not talk about fundamentally stopping this problem. That's the answer in the smoking. And if you notice, when lifestyle, all of us who've tried to intervene, you intervene on one successfully, you're much more likely to intervene on the other because that good habit is contagious. They feel better, they're energized, they see the benefits. So these don't occur in isolation. That's the deal. And politically, it's a wedge issue. I've run into it like a buzzsaw. First of all, the resistance is orchestrated brilliantly by the tobacco industry, and they find points that resonate with others, right? But one thing with the wedge issue, if everybody in this country who's a non-smoker and who loves their children and wants to protect them said, this is a big wedge issue for me, and if you don't fix it, the 260 million of us will find someone who will. It's over. And we'll talk about how a social movement is needed to change this fundamentally so we can change the direction of our country. So, in the discovery, which is mammoth, if anyone doesn't believe it, it's about like denying the Holocaust. It's true, and it's in reams. So here's what some of the tobacco companies say. Today's teenager is tomorrow's potential regular customer, and the overwhelming majority of smokers first begin to smoke while they're still in teens. The smoking patterns of teenagers are of particular importance to us. R.J. Reynolds talked about the teenagers, again, 14 to 18. Smoking, by the way, begins in junior high. Brown and Williamson, cool stake in the 16 to 25-year-old population is of such value that this audience should be accurately weighed and reflected in our current media campaigns. Media campaigns, however, were blunted by the agreements, by the tobacco cessation agreement, and now we're being overwhelmed by new products. All the magazines will be reviewed to see how efficiently they reach this group. These are from people who know it kills people on a scale that is unprecedented in this country every day. Laurillard, the basis of our business is the high school student. Is there any doubt that they're targeting our children? Now, I hope you can see this. There's a mixture here of candy and tobacco products. And when you look at them, each tobacco product is matched perfectly with a popular candy. And I think the strategy is neatly summed up by the comment made by U.S. Tobacco. Cherry Scholar for somebody who likes the taste of candy, if you know what I'm saying. When you see this flavoring, it's aimed at kids, it's aimed at feeding the addiction machine. And my question to all of us, and myself included, is why don't we stop it? We know exactly the tactics they're using, and we know exactly the scale, the carnage that it takes. They target children. We could go on, but just take this one to the bank. They target children, and what we're doing is ineffective in protecting our children. Here's some new products to entice youth. These are new entries into the market. Let me see, got some notes here.